activist and Liberty Lobby founder Willis Carto. Carto, publisher of Spotlight magazine, now called the American Free Press, has inspired people like Timothy McVeigh, William Pierce, and others on the radical right. Mr. Michael was able to get rare access to Willis Carto for the book. This talk, hosted by Barnes & Noble Booksellers in Johnson City, Tennessee, is 45 minutes.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is George Michael. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here today. And today I'm going to discuss my most recent book. It's called Willis Carto and the American Far Right. Now, most Americans have never heard of Willis Carto. Nevertheless, he has been a very influential figure in American politics. Specifically, he's the central figure in the post-World War II American far right. He founded the Liberty Lobby, which, until its dissolution in 2001, was the most enduring institution of the far right. He's an intriguing man. He has this reputation of being a kind of shadowy figure. And over the long course of his career, he's tended to avoid the limelight, and he's preferred to really work behind the scenes in those projects in which he's been involved. He's been involved in virtually every major enterprise in the American far right in the post-war era. He's been involved in some very controversial projects. For example, he established an institutional basis for Holocaust denial. He published many right-wing books, including 2 newspapers, the Spotlight and later American Free Press. During the 1980s, he attempted to create a viable third party, the Populist Party, and I'll talk more about those projects shortly. Over the course of his career, he's reached out to persons on both the fringe and the mainstream. For a while, he worked for the John Birch Society. He later would go on to publish the memoirs of some leading surviving Nazis. Yet, he also reached out to members of the mainstream right as well, including some conservative members of Congress. Let me just give you a little bit of background on my interest on this topic. Back around 2000 or so, I met Willis Carto for the first time. I was working on a dissertation on the extreme right. I was a graduate student at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. So naturally, I wanted to meet and interview Mr. Carto. And so a few years later, I approached him and asked him if I could write his biography, if he would assist me in that effort. At first, he was reluctant, but after a while, he decided that he would assist me. He gave me a series of interviews, and he gave me access to a lot of his files. Before I go any further, let me define some terms. What do I mean when I say far right? Well, the far right consists collectively of the radical right and the extreme right. And the radical right's underpinnings can be traced back to groups such as the John Birch Society and the Minutemen organizations that gained notoriety in the 1960s. The Patriot or militia movement was really the most recent manifestation of that segment. Now, the race issue figures much more prominently in the extreme right than it does for the radical right. And characteristics of the extreme right include the following. First, anti-statism. The movement exhibits an acute disaffection with the government. Also, the movement tends to have a conspiratorial worldview. The far right has this tendency to really look beneath the surface of American politics and find these kind of elite cabals at work subverting society. Finally, the extreme right espouses an element of racism and anti-Semitism. So I put together this typology of the far right. Would include the following major segments. First, the Patriot movement. That would include groups like the John Birch Society, the militia movement. There's also the revolutionary racialist right. That would include various Christian identity groups, the National Alliance, and other assorted neo-Nazi groups. Then the non-revolutionary racialist right. That would include groups like the Council of Conservative Citizens and also David Duke's organization. And finally, historical revisionism. Sometimes that's referred to as Holocaust denial. And over the years, Carto has really maintained connections with representatives of all of these segments of the far right. Now, in order for me to contextualize the role of Carto, let me discuss very briefly the far right preceding his involvement. The formative years of the contemporary American far right occurred in the early part of the last century. So in a sense, Carto is really the heir to that tradition. For example, in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan was resurrected at Stone Mountain, Georgia. And it actually became a mass movement during the 1920s, in part to a very popular movie that was produced by D.W. Griffith. It was called Birth of a Nation. It lionized the Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan. And according to some estimates, membership reached up to 3 million members, and that was really a remarkable figure. During the 1920s, nativism was a very important movement in America. In 1924, for example, Congress passed a very restrictive Immigration Act, and it restricted immigration to mostly immigrants from Western Europe. The eugenics movement was popular at that time, and so was scientific racism. There were scholars such as Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. They wrote best-selling books that extolled the virtues of the Nordic race and the perils that race faced from, as Stoddard put it, the rising tide of color. Also in the 1930s, there were various native fascist movements that were active, some of which were openly sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Groups such as the German-American Bund and William Dudley Pelley's Silver Shirts organization, they gained quite a bit of attention and notoriety at that time. The person who's considered to be the leading intellectual and spokesperson of that movement during that period was someone by the name of Lawrence Dennis, and I have his picture there on the slide. He wrote a book called The Coming American Fascism, in which he advocated an authoritarian government that would implement a corporatist-style economy, not unlike the models in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And Carto actually maintained a correspondence with Dennis after the war. He republished some of his books. Now, interestingly, just as an aside, Dennis actually had a multiracial background. I believe his father was white and his mother was black. Dennis, as they said back then, passed as white, so it's somewhat ironic he was considered really the chief spokesperson of the native fascist movement in America, but he was actually biracial. But that did not really seem to bother Carto's racial sensibilities. But anyway, the far right really found itself on the wrong side of history during the 1940s. President Roosevelt believed that America would eventually have to intervene in the war in Europe. So in that sense, the native fascists really played into his hands because he could hold them up as bogeymen or fifth columnists that threatened America. So as a result of the war and the legacy of the Holocaust, the far right was really delegitimized. But the landmark Supreme Court decision, the Brown decision in 1954, re-galvanized the racialist right in America. Furthermore, the Cold War and the ensuing Red Scare created some room for the far right to once again reassert itself in American politics. And so Willis Carto entered politics around 1952. And I'll discuss his foray into politics shortly, but first let me give you a little bit of background on his early life. He grew up in 1926 in Fort Wayne. He was born in 1926 and he grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he seems fairly typical for someone of his generation. As he told me, his father was a kind of a Chamber of Commerce type. His parents had a stable marriage. Willis had one younger brother. From a young age, Willis Carto told me he was interested in newspapers. When he was in high school, he produced a local newspaper. It was called the Canteen Chronicle, and he disseminated it to his friends and fellow students. And so, from what I can infer, his youth was really unremarkable. He did not have any rightist leanings at that point in his life. So after graduation from high school in 1944, he was drafted into the Army, and he served in the Pacific Theater near the end of World War II. And while he was in the Philippines, a Japanese sniper shot him. He was struck in the shoulder, but he was not too seriously wounded. But after the war, he moved to Ohio. He attended Denison University for about 2 years, but he did not graduate. He then went directly into the law school at the University of Cincinnati, but he dropped out after one semester. Wanderlust really seemed to get the best of him. He wanted to see the country. He took a variety of jobs that required him to do a lot of traveling around the country. And it was really during this period that his political worldview began to crystallize. Prior to that, he did not really have much experience with racial minorities, but as a result of his travels, he began to develop a set of attitudes on race and politics. And increasingly, he came to believe that the government would line up on the wrong side of what he saw as the pressing issues of the day, issues like immigration, foreign policy, and race relations. So his first major foray in politics came in 1955. That's when he launched the newsletter called Right. And the principal aim of that newsletter was to create some coherence for the often very fractured far right. Many leading rightists contributed articles to the newsletter. The newsletter was very critical of the Eisenhower administration. Anti-communism was another popular theme. There was a strong critique of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Now, at first, Wright was critical of big oil, such as the Rockefeller Trust. However, as time went by, Israel and its supporters were implicated as the main culprits in that region of the world. Not surprisingly, Wright was very critical of the nascent civil rights movement. But still, Carto actually maintained correspondence with Elijah Muhammad. He reached out to some black separatists, such as Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. And there was a meeting of the minds insofar as both opposed desegregation, they favored racial separatism. So out of these various discussions that took place in the pages of Right came this idea that the far right needed some kind of base or lobbying organization. And so Liberty Lobby was founded in the late 1950s. By 1960, Liberty Lobby established an office near the Library of Congress in downtown Washington, D.C. And on occasion, representatives of Liberty Lobby actually testified before congressional committees and congressional subcommittees. And for a while, Liberty Lobby actually succeeded in courting some of the more conservative members of Congress. For example, Representatives Albert Watson, Bill Dickinson, John Rarick, and Senators Carl Munt and Strom Thurmond, among others. So for outward appearances, Liberty Lobby appeared to be a rather mainstream conservative organization. However, beneath the surface of the organization, Carto really promoted a philosophy that was really much more on the fringe. In particular, Carto's worldview was greatly influenced by this kind of rather obscure and mysterious figure whose name was Francis Parker Yockey. Yockey wrote a very important book in the far-right subculture called Imperium. And in it, he advanced this notion that there should be a united Europe extending from the Urals in Russia in the east to Ireland in the west. And this united Europe should be built on principles not unlike Hitler's Third Reich. He actually dedicated his book to Hitler. I believe he referred to him as the hero of the Second World War. And in Hitler's Third Reich, he saw an attempt to halt what he saw as the civilizational decline of the West. Yockey based much of his analysis on the work of the German philosopher Oswald Spengler. Of course, Spengler wrote the book Decline of the West. Now, I don't have too much time to go into Yockey's background, but he was a learned man. He graduated from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He later went on to get a law degree from Notre Dame. And interestingly, after World War II, he actually worked as a prosecutor at the Allied Crimes War Tribunal in Wiesbaden, Germany, at which some of the lower-level Nazis were being tried. However, he resigned in protest to what he saw as the mistreatment of the Germans. And not long thereafter, he left for Ireland, and while there, he wrote the book Imperium. That was in the late 1940s. The United States State Department actually kept an extensive dossier on Yockey. There was some suspicion that he may have worked for the Soviets while he was traveling throughout Europe. And actually, this would not really be too surprising because he did evince an acute anti-Americanism, and it was based on his anti-Semitic outlook of American politics. He believed that with the election of Franklin Roosevelt as president, that Jews had come to control America and had taken the country on this destructive course. But anyway, to make a long story short, Yockey returned to America in 1960. He was arrested in San Francisco, and he was held on passport violation charges. And at that time, Carto resided not far from the jail where Yockey was being held. And so Carto made it a point to visit him. Carto interviewed him and offered what little support he could give him. But anyway, not long thereafter, Yockey committed suicide. During the night, he swallowed a cyanide capsule. But after this episode, Carto published Yockey's book, and he was really responsible for popularizing the book in the far-right subculture. And over the years, Carto would really go on to promote Yockey's ideas. Often this was done in a kind of esoteric way, beneath the surface of his various publishing organs. But still, Carto often put on a mainstream conservative veneer to his various publishing ventures. The newsletter Right ceased publication in 1960, and it was replaced by another newsletter called Liberty Letter. And that newsletter was much more respectable and mainstream in its rhetoric than its predecessor. It championed many of the standard conservative causes of the 1960s. For example, Carto supported the candidacy of Senator Barry Goldwater in his presidential bid in 1964. He mobilized the far right to support Goldwater. And the goal was really to steer the Republican Party in a more conservative direction to Carto's liking. Carto was also very critical of both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and also the Nixon administration that succeeded them. Because he was anti-communist, Carto initially supported the Vietnam War, but he once told me, however, that in retrospect, he regretted taking that position. Other than Vietnam, Carto has maintained a consistently anti-interventionist position with respect to American foreign policy. Not surprisingly, the candidacy of Governor George Wallace excited elements of the racialist right, including Carto. So in 1968, Carto founded a group called Youth for Wallace, and it later evolved into another group called the National Youth Alliance. And the group really patterned itself as a kind of rightist counterpart to the New Left that was active on college campuses during that period. Eventually, someone by the name of Dr. William L. Pierce became the leader of that group. He eventually broke with Carto, and he later renamed it the National Alliance. And it would go on to be the leading neo-Nazi organization in America. And just as an aside, it's still extant today. I believe it has its headquarters in Hillsborough, West Virginia. But anyway, as an aside, Pierce was the author of a book called The Turner Diaries. It was an underground bestseller in the extreme right subculture. And it was supposed to have had a big influence on Timothy McVeigh. Of course, he was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Now, Carto's brand of conservatism differs quite a bit from mainstream conservatism. Over the years, he has promoted a kind of populist variant of conservatism. For example, he champions racial separatism under the guise of self-determination. He promotes what he refers to as an American foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, which essentially means that the United States should not support Israel. Carto is also very critical of free trade. He believes that it's bad for the American economy and that it hurts American workers. And in order to advance his populist worldview, he edited a book. It was called Profiles in Populism. And in it, he profiled what he saw as the genuine populist in American history. Some of the persons profiled in the book included Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Robert Taft, Henry Ford, just to name a few. In 1975, Carto launched his most important publishing vehicle. It was a newspaper called The Spotlight, and it soon became the leading organ of the far right. In 1980, its circulation reached over 330,000, which is really an impressive figure for really what amounted to an underground newspaper. But The Spotlight appealed to virtually all segments of the far right. It addressed the race issue, but usually in a kind of subtle way. The paper also popularized a lot of the conspiracy theories that gained currency in the far-right subculture. The paper also had a very strident critique of globalization and elite organizations such as the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberger Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, just to name a few. And as Carto correctly points out, these organizations do indeed include very wealthy, powerful, and influential persons. And he believes that they promote a globalist agenda that is detrimental to American national interest. Even more controversial, Carto has devoted much effort to Holocaust denial. Now, I really don't have time to go into a detailed history of Holocaust denial, but in a certain sense, Holocaust denial is an effort to deconstruct the sanctity of the Holocaust. The first notable Holocaust revisionist was a Frenchman by the name of Paul Racinet. And during World War II, he was actually involved in the anti-Nazi resistance in France. He was arrested and he actually spent some time at the Dachau concentration camp. But in 1949, he wrote a book. It was called Crossing the Line, and that was really the first major treatise of Holocaust denial. But probably the definitive work, though, is Arthur Butz's book, The Hoax of the 20th Century. I think that was released in 1976. And there were many revisionists, no, not a lot, but there were several that published books over the years. But still, for many years, the Holocaust revisionist movement did not really have any kind of institutional framework. But that changed in 1978. And that year, Willis Carto founded something called the Institute for Historical Review. So with the creation of the IHR, or Institute for Historical Review, Carto really established an institutional basis for Holocaust denial. He published a journal called the Journal for Historical Review, and the IHR held conferences at which these so-called revisionist historians, they could present their controversial research and meet like-minded persons. And it's worth mentioning that over the years, Carto has worked with some of the leading surviving figures of the Third Reich. For example, he published the memoirs of Leon de Grelle. Leon de Grelle led a Waffen-SS division that was composed of Belgian volunteers, and he was actually the most highly decorated foreigner in service of the Third Reich. According to legend, when Hitler awarded him his Knight's Cross, he shook hands with him and said, "If I had had a son, I would have wanted him to have been just like you." Carto also published the memoirs of Hans Ulrich Rudel. He was the famed Stuka, or dive bomber pilot. Otto Rehmer spoke at one of the IHR conferences. It was he who put down the anti-Hitler coup after the assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944. Here's an interesting photo, I think that was taken in 1973. It's a picture of Carto along with his wife and Otto Skorzeny in the middle. Otto Skorzeny was Hitler's top commando. It was he who actually led the rescue mission of Mussolini in 1943. But after the war, he wrote some articles for one of Carto's organs called American Mercury. Now, in view of Carto's many controversial projects, it's not surprising that he has occasioned quite a bit of opposition. And over the years, his chief nemesis has been the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL. The ADL is the leading Jewish defense organization in the United States. And the ADL has really sought to marginalize Carto and kind of keep him out of the mainstream, kind of keep him out of the marketplace of ideas. And on occasion, the ADL has released critical reports on him, often characterizing him as the leading anti-Semite in America. It's also worth mentioning that Carto has feuded with members of the mainstream conservative movement as well, most notably with the late William F. Buckley. Buckley, his National Review magazine, carried a very critical cover story of Carto back in 1971, and on a few occasions the two actually sued each other for libel. Besides Holocaust denial, Carto has pursued some more mainstream endeavors as well. For example, in 1984, he sought to create a viable third party. It was called the Populist Party. And in 1984, the former Olympic athlete, Bob Richards, he ran as the party's presidential candidate. He did, however, later repudiate Carto and the party. But the party attracted some prominent activists from the far right. In particular, the party really played an important role in the political aspirations of David Duke. In 1988, he ran as the party's presidential candidate, And although he did not get many votes in that election, the next year he did win a seat in the Louisiana state legislature with the help of some of Carto's staffers. Also, Duke obtained a copy of Carto's mailing list, and by doing so, he was able to really greatly expand his donor base. But despite Carto's effort to create a viable third party, the Populist Party splintered and effectively dissolved by the early 1990s. Nevertheless, Carto still maintained, he still had a major influence on the far right, which took on an increasingly radical orientation during the 1980s and 90s. Carto's paper was very popular with the fledgling militia movement in the 1990s. Timothy McVeigh was said to be an avid reader of the Spotlight. He would distribute the newspaper to his acquaintances. The paper popularized many of the conspiracy theories that were circulating in the movement at that time. For example, this notion that there were United Nations troops stationed across the border in Mexico that were preparing to invade America, or that black helicopters were spying on Americans, just to name a few. Now, an important episode in the history of Liberty Lobby occurred in 1993. And that year, a subsidiary that Carto had created, the Institute for Historical Review, broke from his control. And there were some differences as far as the editorial direction of the journal, things like that. But the main contention between the two parties appeared to be over money. A grandniece of Thomas Edison, a woman by the name of Jean Farrell Edison, she bequeathed quite a bit of money to the organization. I think it was about $10 million. So there was a bitter dispute over who should control that money. Now, although Carto was not the official director of the IHR, he effectively raised money for the entity and controlled it from behind the scenes. But anyway, the IHR board of directors managed to remove Carto from the organization. But still, Carto controlled that money that Ms. Farrell had bequeathed to the organization. And so this affair went on for quite some time, for about 8 years. And at times it got quite nasty. But it went through the courts, and eventually the IHR, under the leadership of Mark Weber, won the battle. And as a result of this judicial decision, Liberty Lobby and Carto were ordered to pay a sizable amount of money to the IHR. And so consequently, Carto was forced to declare bankruptcy, and Liberty Lobby was dissolved. Also, Spotlight ceased publication. So it was somewhat ironic that the most enduring institution of the far right was not defeated by one of its ideological opponents, such as the Anti-Defamation League, but rather resulted from an internecine feud with the former subsidiary that Carto had created. Now, for his part, Carto claimed that other entities were behind the IHR, including the Church of Scientology, the CIA, and the Israeli Mossad. But I don't really have time, though, to go into those conspiracy theories. Carto, though, is not one to give up easily. Despite that setback, a few months later, he effectively reconstituted the Spotlight as another newspaper called American Free Press. And on the slide, I've included some of the frequent themes in his most recent publications. The paper has been very critical of the Bush administration and his so-called neoconservative advisors and supporters. Carto has had a very strident critique of the so-called Israel lobby long before John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. Therefore, it's not surprising that the paper has often been very sympathetic to the Arab and Muslim side in the Middle East conflict. In fact, one of his staffers, I have his picture there, Michael Collins Piper, he's actually conferred with some of the leading statesmen in the Islamic world, including the former president of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, and more recently, the Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. In fact, when Ahmadinejad and Piper first met in 2006, Ahmadinejad invited Piper to be his guest in Iran, and Piper was one of the participants at the Holocaust conference that was held in Tehran in December 2006. The Iranian government sponsored the conference, which Ahmadinejad attended. David Duke actually gave the keynote address. Interestingly, Carto has championed some Latin American left-wing icons, including the current president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. The paper has defended Chavez as a genuine populist who has resisted American imperialism and the so-called New World Order. Now, when I interviewed Carto and he reflected upon his career, he was somewhat self-dismissive. He believed his approach in trying to unite the right was seriously flawed. And Carto really thought that it was folly to get these various rightist parties and personalities to cooperate in any kind of meaningful way. He thought that only a charismatic figure who could command loyalty could forge a viable rightist movement in the United States. He was alluding, of course, to the example of Adolf Hitler. So what can one say in conclusion about Willis Carto? Well, to his critics, he contributed to the politics of paranoia in America, and he may have influenced impressionable young men like Timothy McVeigh. Furthermore, some people would say that he advanced a toxic form of racism. He also provided an institutional basis for Holocaust denial, and in doing so, his critics maintain that he trivialized one of the greatest tragedies in human history. Now, from the perspective of the far right, it was he who really kept the movement's ideological flame burning over the years. He created a center of gravity for the movement, and he provided vehicles for post-war rightists to disseminate their views. And more than any other figure, it was Carto who really shaped the movement's ideology and guided its direction. Yet, he fell short of many of his goals. For example, although Liberty Lobby sought to influence the United States Congress, it never really attained serious credibility in Washington, D.C. Moreover, in the post-war era, the American far right has really been a marginalized movement. It's really seen beyond the pale of respectability, and this trend continues to this day. And despite his efforts to unite the far right, the movement is still beset by these kind of internecine squabbles, as evidenced by his experiences with the Populist Party and the Institute for Historical Review. And finally, by promoting so many disparate and sometimes arcane conspiracy theories, one could argue that in a certain sense, Carto trivialized what might be called a larger far-right ideology. And to this day, the movement has not really attained a coherent ideology on which its activists and followers can agree. And this shortcoming has really restricted the far right's ability to establish a mass movement and develop a sense of unity that would allow it to mobilize effectively on a broad scale. Nevertheless, Carto has had an enormous influence on a movement that will probably endure well into the current century. Moreover, the issues that seem to fuel the far right, including immigration, globalization, multiculturalism, the conflict in the Middle East, they're likely to continue to loom large in this century. And so it was Carto, really more than any other figure, that shaped the far right's position on those issues. And as a result, his influence will extend, I think, for many years beyond his lifetime. So if you folks have any questions at this time, I'd be glad to try to answer them the best I can.
Okay. Congratulations, Dr. Michaels, on your new book. I'm sure it'll be very successful. You spoke, I think we all understand that Carter was a very polarizing force in terms of right-wing ideology. He was very critical of JFK and four presidents, and he had a populist view. But my question is, can you please describe the interview, how you went about to choose Carter to write on him and learn more about him? Could you describe his lifestyle? Did he live a very simple lifestyle, extravagant? And what was his views in terms of the world, and what did he relate to you in this book? Kind of just describe your interview and what kind of lifestyle, and did you go out, things like that. To dinners, things like that, just describe, because I'm really interested in that and how you got about to interview him.
Yeah, well, Carto has been a very reclusive figure. He tends to shun attention from the media. Sometimes he'll give interviews to his own publishing organs, but he doesn't really talk to outside people. I got to know one of his staffers, Michael Collins Piper, who's kind of has an opposite personality of Carto. he's quite gregarious. And I was working on a doctoral dissertation in, I think, around 2001. And so I first contacted Liberty Lobby, and I requested an interview with Carto. And every time I tried to get the interview, the staffer would tell me that he's too busy. But after a while, I think Carto decided he would just give me an interview. The first time it was in December 2000. It was, probably about an hour interview. About 2 years later, I followed up and I asked him if he would allow me to write his biography. And at first, when I asked him, he said no. But he was getting advanced in age. He was in his upper 70s at that time. And I think he started to think about his position in history. And so that's why I think he reconsidered and allowed me to write this biography with his assistance, because it would have been hard to do without his assistance, because he's just been too reclusive. It would be hard to put all the pieces together for the story. As far as his personal life, his lifestyle, he's been married for about almost 50 years, I believe. He doesn't seem to live an extravagant lifestyle. I was over his home at his house once. It's a rather modest home. He actually drives an older car. Although he's in his early 80s right now, he still works quite a bit. And he seems really kind of like almost like an uncle or a grandfather when you meet him, kind of unremarkable. He doesn't have a real significant presence when you first meet him. But that said, over the years, I've come to the conclusion that he is a man of considerable intelligence, especially when it comes to organizing. So he seems to have a very stable home life. I've never heard any kind of allegations of any kind of improprieties or anything like that in his personal life. Now, some people have complained about his dealings with other people on the far right, his fundraising and things like that. They say sometimes he rules in a kind of despotic fashion at those organizations that he leads. But as far as his personal life, it seems really quite remarkable, unremarkable, and quite stable.
Hello, Dr. Michael. My question for you today is, do you think Willis Carto has any effect on politics today, or if anybody still takes him seriously in the political aspect?
Well, one thing I didn't really have a chance to explore, because I finished writing the draft around, I think it was around July 2006. But it would be interesting to find out how much of an influence he had on the success of Ron Paul's most recent campaign. I believe the Ron Paul organization obtained a copy of Carto's mailing list. A lot of Ron Paul's editorials are republished in Carto's newspaper, American Free Press. So I don't really have a definitive answer how much of Ron Paul's fundraising success can be attributed to people in Carto's network. But as far as his influence in mainstream politics, I would say it's quite limited. At one time, Liberty Lobby would testify before congressional committees, but that was really quite some time ago. More often than not, Liberty Lobby, if people are aware of it in D.C., it's usually seen as something that's beyond the pale of respectability.
Yes, Doctor. Hi. Given the IHR was born out of the American far right, whose inherent political philosophy was almost ubiquitously racial segregationism, why do you think the IHR now focuses almost exclusively on anti-Semitism?
On anti-Semitism? Well, I think the main reason for that is in the far right, they think that World War II was really a watershed period in American history, that it really set into motion a lot of negative trends, bad trends, that threatened the survival of the West. And so they have a very kind of anti-Semitic worldview, and they think that the Holocaust really is kind of a linchpin of this New World Order that they say is controlled by Zionists, so on and so forth. And they believe a way to kind of undercut that or undermine that they think is through this very controversial enterprise of Holocaust denial. Yes, the race issue does figure in some aspects of historical revisionism, because it really encompasses more than just the Holocaust. It includes also critique of Zionism in Israel, but also it has there are revisionist studies on slavery in America and apartheid in South Africa and other issues related to that.
Dr. Michael, you spoke briefly about Carter's denial of the Holocaust, and in history books, government books, pretty much it states that the Holocaust indeed happened, but in your PowerPoint presentations it says that Carter denied the Holocaust. Could you go a little bit in depth to how he did, what was his denial, and how he kind of came to believe that it never happened?
Yeah, well, Carto will concede that many Jews perished in World War II, and most revisionists will concede that, but they argue about numbers. They say it didn't reach 6 million, that it was maybe 250,000. Moreover, they say there were no gas chambers in the concentration camps. Now, there has been research that suggested that there were not gas chambers in the camps in Germany, but the revisionists take it a step further. They say there were no gas chambers at the Auschwitz death camp in Poland, which is far more controversial. But they really, their main contention is numbers. They say it wasn't quite as bad as the mainstream historians assert. As far as Carto, how he came to believe in Holocaust denial, he really was involved in that in the 1950s. There was a person's name, I think Hagen, I can't remember the title of his book, but that was one of the first books, I think, that really caught Carto's attention and kind of converted him, if you will, to Holocaust denial. Also, he worked with Elmer Barnes, who was considered one of the chief revisionist historians after World War I. He was one of the persons who explored this notion of this unique German war guilt stemming from World War I. And so actually Carto named his revisionist journal the Barnes Review after Mr. Barnes. He felt that he was the leading revisionist historian of the 20th century.
So he believed that the Holocaust happened, but it wasn't on like large scale as the mainstream viewed it?
Yes, that's essentially in a nutshell Carto's view on the Holocaust, yes.
As you described him as an intelligent man, and I'm sure he obviously felt he was very patriotic. How would he justify his actions and his movement, you know, compared to American ideals like tolerance and equality and social justice? How can he legitimately promote his ideals, believing that those things are the foundation of America?
Well, a lot of that really goes back to his populist worldview. As far as tolerance, he would say, well, he has nothing against people of other races. Rather, he favors kind of racial separatism that's consistent with this high-minded notion of self-determination. Also, he believes things like free trade, it's bad, that it undercuts the American economy and it hurts American workers. So he actually will couch a lot of his positions based on the welfare of American workers, the average Americans, middle class, so on and so forth. So that he frames it in a certain way in his populist worldview that he thinks he really is mindful of what's best for Americans. He would argue that these elite globalist organizations, the U.S. Congress and the presidency, it is they who are really out of touch with what mainstream Americans want. So it's a matter of perspective, I suppose. Yeah.
Was there ever, like, did you ever get the feeling, or did he ever hint out a U.S. president that he did support ever, or did he not say anything about them?
Oh, that president that he supported? Well, that was a long time ago. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson may have been the last president I guess he really admired. I'm not sure. But yeah, going way back in the 20th century, I don't think, since the 20th century, he did not really care for any American presidents. Okay. One more?
Thank you for coming today.
Okay, well, thank you, folks. Okay, thank you.
George Michael, author of Willis Carto and the American Far Right, is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. For more information, visit www.wise.virginia.edu.